Hello, everyone, and welcome again to CAWASA Wednesday webinar. This is episode number 9 of our 2022 series, and we trust that you've all been keeping well and safe. And don't think that COVID is all over, but I think we're getting some relief, but let's be keeping safe and well. Today, we are joined by a special guest who hails out of the United States. He's a graduate of Clemson University with a Bachelor of Civil Engineering and also has a Master in Public Administration and has been a career engineering consultant for 13 years of his 44-year career in the business of the water sector. And over the last 27 years of his career, he was a special purpose district water utility, and with over 22 of those years as the chief executive officer, the CEO of that utility. And so now he has been appointed by the General Assembly of the state of South Carolina to the South Carolina Public Service Commission. And this commission regulates the rates and services of investor-owned public utilities, such as electric, gas, water, and wastewater utilities. In addition, the South Carolina PSC regulates the rates and services of some telecommunications and motor vehicle carriers, among other things. Yeah, he's well decorated with his qualifications and experience. And without no further ado, I'd like to welcome to our webinar this afternoon as our special guest speaker, Mr. Mike Caston. Over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Iglesias. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I am.
Life is certainly a journey. That's why it's regulated to regulator. And one thing I can say about the states is they really like to regulate stuff. So in the Public Service Commission, we do regulate those rates and services, as you pointed out, for investor-owned utilities. And what I wanted to do as far as the discussion points, and I only have 16 slides, counting the question slide. So I'm going to ask you questions as we cover some of the slides, just for my edification. But the primary discussion points are, as I wanted to kind of explain the distinction between the IOUs, the public investor-owned utilities, and the municipal governmental utility. What I learned as a consultant for, working for years for many municipal utilities, municipal and governmental utilities, and some private utilities I did some consulting work for. Lessons I learned as a CEO or a general manager of a municipal or governmental entity. The utility I worked at was actually something called a special purpose district. And what that was is we were actually created by our state government back in the late 50s, because in those days, the utilities, the water, wastewater utilities, and sometimes even power, electricity, was pretty much confined to the metropolitan areas, the cities or bigger communities. So the General Assembly established some things like the Special Purpose District to be responsible for serving unserved areas. And that's basically the utility I worked with. That's what we were. And I'll go over briefly my role as a commissioner of the Public Service Commission relative to IOUs. And lessons learned. How did these previous roles help me in my current role? And at the beginning, I mentioned that life is a journey. It is. And you will learn that in your career. Okay, this slide. I suspect some of you recognize the portrait of this gentleman. Anybody want to take a stab at who you think that is?
I know.
Who?
Hi, Mike.
I know you do. I knew you would. That's why I said, nah, she's too British. Don't let her answer. This is one of the many portraits, and I probably should have written where it was, of William Shakespeare. A famous South Carolinian. No, I'm kidding. I'm not going to take credit for a British guy, okay, Valerie? Anyway, I kind of borrowed one of his phrases. Wastewater plant by any other name would still smell like poop. Just out of curiosity, does anyone know where I might have kind of plagiarized that particular statement?
I do.
Oh, sweet Romeo. Romeo and Juliet, of course. And I suspect he would be really kind of bent out of shape if he knew I used that particular part for a wastewater treatment facility. But he's not here to criticize it. Valerie can, but he can't. These are a couple of actually stock photos, water treatment plant, wastewater treatment plant. And I entitled it, municipal, investor owned. Do we know? Truth is, you can't look at them and necessarily tell whether it's a municipal governmental owned facility or investor owned facility. So what is the distinction? Is there a distinction? The municipal, and I say governmental, and the investor-owned utilities, they both have the same responsibility to provide safe water, reliable service, and to perpetuate themselves. In other words, run the system, maintain it, so it will continue to function, years from now. They both have that responsibility. And for this to be done, both types of these utilities need to charge rates and fees that allow them to do this, as do all the systems you folks work for. Now, how this is done is the key distinction between the municipal governmental utility and an investor-owned utility, at least in the states. Now, let me look at some of these chat. There's some chat here. Okay, good. That's just everyone saying hello. As I recall, and Valerie, you would know this also, is I believe most of the, if not all of the utilities, I guess in the Caribbean, I know it's St. Lucia and Barbados, I think, were governmental owned. Is that correct?
Correct. Most
St.
of the
Lucia, yeah.
utilities are all government owned.
So they, to me, would fall in that municipal governmental utility. There may be some distinctions or differences as to how rates are set or revenues are developed, but generally speaking, municipal system, typically like in the States, one such as this, the utility is a not-for-profit, and I suspect all of you know what that is, but basically they exist to serve customers and not to make a profit. Now, that's kind of misunderstood sometimes because they think a municipal or governmental utility, since it's not supposed to make a profit, should not make more money than it spends. Well, that's not true. That's not the way it should be done, or you prefer it to be done, because you still have to perpetuate the system. So typically with a municipal or government system, the local government or the national government, however the system is set up, sets the rates and services through either councils, boards, or some other elected or appointed body of the governmental body. I suspect most of the utilities participating in this session are that way. And the utility is directly linked to the electorate. In other words, it's customers of the governmental officials. Well, you could say, well, an investor-owned utility, it would be the same. Yeah, to some degree, but, and maybe it doesn't happen with you guys, but on more than one occasion, I would get a call from an elected official because some customer who lived in that elected official's area complained about something, and that's fine. You know, that's not a problem. But that tends to occur more in a municipal governmental system, at least in my experience, than with an investor-owned utility. Also, municipal systems usually have access, at least in the states, to something called general obligation bonds, which are funded by ad valorem taxes from residents and businesses. In other words, in the state, or in the state of South Carolina, and pretty much in the United States, the assessed value, they assess the value of property in a utility service area, and they assess taxes based on that, which in essence like a property tax, not exclusively, but many municipal systems, governmental systems, can generate cash flow for capital expenditures, some for general operations and maintenance. We could not, and that's probably not the best way to do it. Municipal utilities can issue revenue bonds. And these revenue bonds are paid for or generated by revenue. Sorry, that's my dog. Revenue bonds, as the name implies, you know, bonds can be issued to either the general public or smaller groups or banks or through banks or however. And they are paid back with an interest by the revenue generated from the utility. And municipal utilities, governmental utilities can often do that. And generally they can do them with tax exemptions, which is always a plus. Governmental utilities are not for profit, at least in the states, do not have to pay property taxes or tax on profits or capital gains. The investor-owned utilities do. They're you know, privately owned or owned by a group of investors. They will have to pay taxes on their profits or any capital gains and such. But as a governmental entity, at least our utility did not have to. I suspect that is also true of the utilities there. And the rates and services are usually established through council boards or some other elected or appointed body. As I recall, that was the case, at least with the utilities I was familiar with there, or at least had some experience with, very limited. All right, now investor-owned utility. I showed kind of a picture of a subdivision or a neighborhood. Typically in the States, investor-owned utilities began or spring up where development occurred, but there was no public utility, or it was too far or didn't make good economic sense for them to serve that area. So the developers typically would put in the utility, the water lines, the sewer lines, the wastewater plant or sewer lagoon, sometimes wholesale buy from a municipal system or put in wells or whatever. And the developers typically didn't want to be in that business, so they would either give them or sell them to investors. That's not exclusively where they come from, but generally speaking. They're for profit and they have private owners and or investors. They may reside in a government official's area. Most likely all of them do, but it's not owned by a municipality or a governmental entity. So the legislator really doesn't have as much clout as he would like to have, at least in the States. And water and wastewater systems are often located in subdivisions that didn't have access to those systems, as I previously mentioned. Now, are any of you aware of any investor-owned utilities in your areas or in or around your utility? I was thinking, and Valerie, you may know this if you're still on, the resorts, maybe many of the resorts may have private systems. I'm not real sure, but
Yes.
are they investor-owned, do you think?
They would
Or
be owned by
private?
the resort, which is usually owned, there's in some places in the Caribbean there are chains, but others are smaller, more individually owned properties. But Ignatius, you can answer the question better. You're there.
Yeah, well, as we indicated, most of the utilities are owned by governments, either that they are statutory bodies or that they are state-owned enterprises, as it were. And you may have in a few of the countries where the producers of, particularly with desalination systems, where these systems would be owned by private sector investors and would sell bulk water to the government utilities. There are still a few that in some jurisdictions who also produce and distribute, but these are in a minority.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
And of
I know
course, as you mentioned, a few of the resorts would have some small systems of their own to produce water. But
our experience was that also.
In Barbados, you'd have, is it 5 Cs, 7 Cs? Is a private company that does the brackish water treatment.
yeah, there are a few desal plants there in Barbados.
Yeah.
And I think in southern Trinidad, and also for those who produce for the industrial enterprises in Trinidad, the oil companies. And as you go up in the northern islands, in the Leeward Islands, and further in the Northwest Caribbean, in places as Aruba and Curacao, they do have a lot of these types of combinations.
Well, my experience here is that typically like developers or say resort areas or whatever, they're pretty good at developing, pretty good at resorting, but they don't really want to get into the utility business. So they either sell them or work out a deal with someone else. You take it, you run it or whatever. Now, Valerie, I've heard this spelled or mentioned, I don't know how many different times, but I'm thinking about one of the bigger international utilities or private investors, Thames, THAMES.
That's
How does
Thames
that?
Water. That's in the UK.
Right,
So
right. But they also,
all of the UK utilities were privatized a number of years ago under Maggie Thatcher, and they remain investor owned.
well, I know, I think they were Vivendi and now Xylem or someone, I can't remember. They've pretty much gone international, looking at they were actually acquiring some private American water and wastewater utilities too. So it's a big business.
There will be an increasing number, though, of PPE, private public partnerships, PPPs.
Well, there, in any event, the investor-owned, that type utility are the ones that the Public Service Commission regulates, because they do not have a board or an elected body or something that sets the rates. So they're considered like monopolies. So the electric utilities, the water, wastewater utilities are investor owned, which most of the electric utilities in the states are investor owned, are regulated by the Public Service Commission. Now, in addition, IOUs, the investor-owned utilities, may also issue, revenue bonds also, but not general obligation bonds. And general obligation bonds, is I mentioned earlier, are ad valorem taxes on property, basically. And at least in the states, investor-owned utilities do not have that option. Thank God. Don't say I said that, but goodness, we don't need any more of that. And the investor-owned utility is considered a monopoly, and it rates its services regulated by federal and state statutes and regulations. In other words, the investor-owned water and wastewater utilities still have to comply with our state regulations as far as our environmental state regulations. In South Carolina, that's the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. They also have to comply with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency regulations and rules. And the Public Service Commission is pretty much responsible for services and rates, not the environmental side of it. So, from consulting engineer, did I learn anything? Well, in my experience, probably almost 15 years, exclusively doing consulting work, private engineering work for municipal systems, water and wastewater systems. I learned that well-run utilities usually, and this is almost ubiquitous, or I don't know if there's such a thing as almost, it really was, developed treatment and distribution master plans. They had plans for their system, and they typically updated them every 5 years, depending on the level of growth. If it's a high growth area, they might update them every 3 years, maybe every 2 years. If it's a slow growth area, they might look at them again every 5 years. And they also develop a plan to accomplish their system improvements. In other words, I knew a lot of systems, right? I worked at a lot of systems that spent a lot of money to do a lot of plans, have us come in and do a master plan, a growth projection plan, all kind of wonderful plans, and they'd put them on the shelf and never take them down. but they had a lot of plans. The well-run utilities I observed were those that did those things, did the plans, but then they developed a plan to do the system improvements. They'd have like a 1 to 5 year plan. We're going to do phase 1 of this, phase 2 of that. Now, as a CEO, some of the lessons I found essential. And actually, the utility I went to work for and eventually became the chief executive officer, the general manager, whatever you want to call it, was a utility that I had done some consulting for. They were a client of ours. I used to work for an engineering company called Black and Veatch, which actually has done some work in, I don't know if they may have done some in that area, but I know they've done a lot of international work. But some of the lessons I found essential to a well-run utility as a CEO is to develop and maintain a well-trained staff, have good employee performance management system in place, clear and concise mission. In other words, why do we exist? The utility I work for, why do we exist? What's our purpose? Have a clear vision for the utility the next 5 to 10 years. That's what I was talking about, developing plans and then a plan to work the plan. Okay, we're going to do this stuff. And constantly look for efficiencies and better ways to operate. I think it was Edward Deming, I think it was him that talked about, I don't know that he coined the phrase, total quality management or the Deming cycle or circle they call it, but it was plan, do, check, act. Develop a plan, do it, implement it, work it, and then check it. How's it going? Did it do what we wanted it to do? Do we need to tweak it? I learned much of these items that I just listed. I mean, I don't want to overuse the term ubiquitous, but with well-run utilities, those items were in every single one of them. They're doing something like this, if not these exact things. And I also learned, I made a little note here at the bottom of this one. I learned, at least at the utility I was at, and I think it's true of all of them, is that we existed because of the customer. The customer didn't exist for us. We existed for the customer. And the utility, our utility, really any utility in my view, is only as good as the people who run and work in the utility. So, my role as a commissioner, this is directly from the statute, South Carolina Code of Law. I won't bore you to read it, but you can read it on your own. But the highlighted part I have, the bold part, supervise and regulate the rates and service of every public utility in this state to fix just and reasonable standards, classifications, regulations, practices, and measurements of service. Again, for every public utility in the state. And there's a few electric utilities, but there's really 3 large ones. Actually, 2 of them are 2 of the larger electric utilities in the United States, Dominion Energy and Duke Energy. Pretty big electrical utilities. Good many water and wastewater investor-owned utilities. And we serve as a quasi-judicial manner. We function as judges. We're actually bound by the Code of Judicial Conduct and in addition to the state ethic laws of the state of South Carolina. And I've found that it is essential for me and the other 6 commissioners, the 7 commissioners on the Public Service Commission. It is essential for us to be familiar with current and updated governing statutes. And by that, I mean what they are now, we need to know them because that's what we're making our rulings on. And our General Assembly meets every year from January, supposedly to May. They always seem to carry over to June. But on occasion, they modify some laws that affect us or add some. And that's happened a lot recently. So we need to be familiar with those. And that's pretty important. So some helpful things I've learned in my previous roles relative to where I am now. How did it help me now? Well, as an engineering consultant for a number of utilities, small, medium, large, it allowed me to have a pretty doggone good understanding of the engineering principles that I need to deal with. Because the folks that come before us, you know, they deal with the same stuff I used to have to deal with. As a CEO of a utility, it provided me a good deal of insight into, you know, the general functions. You know, how do you manage, or how should you manage a utility? I had to work with regulatory officials, you know, state, federal. I had to work with customers. I had to work with elected officials. I had to, you know, work with my staff and my governing board. See, I worked at the pleasure of a 5-member board of commission. That's who I worked for. The staff worked for me. I worked for them. So I had to learn how to do all that. And our board that I worked for, our board was appointed by the governor of the state of South Carolina. They weren't elected, they were actually appointed. And our board set, the utility I work for, set their rates, regulations, and policies. All right, relative to water quality, our utility, we were regulated, like I say, by our environmental health organization in the state and EPA. And in addition to those, I call it an alphabet soup. You know, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration. We have so many agencies, I can't keep up with the names. South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. We're going to deal with a bunch of them. And I also learned on the fly, my early years, how to develop budgets and capital plans. It's not something, you know, I guess intuitively you can kind of know it, but it's not something you just wake up with and fully understand. At least I didn't. But working at the utility really helped me a lot. And finally, the greatest thing I learned was this. Ignored problems never get better. They always get worse. I learned that in as a consultant. I learned it as a CEO, and I'm kind of learning that as a, I guess, public official. It's easy not to deal with things, but they never take care of themselves the way you would like for them to. They'll take care of themselves, but usually not well. Hey, and that applies to equipment, pipes, plants, or people. Not that, now you guys may be different. In my utility and places I've worked, there were always those crazy makers you had to work with. Some of it's just personality, some of it is, geez, you know, I wish somebody would kind of deal with that issue. In any event, I blew through this and I got to the question part pretty quick. But I really do hope you have some questions, some feedback.
Mike,
First
I
of
have a
all,
question. Going
yes,
into
ma'am.
the regulatory area now, what do you see as the number one complaint or challenge that you have with compliance for the utilities?
The number one complaint, say like
Or
a customer.
challenge that, that can keep you awake, that the utilities, your utilities present? What should they be doing a lot better?
Well, I've got to be careful answering that for this reason. Part of the code of judicial conduct, I can, be generic, but not address things or talk about things that has come up, could come up, may come up. I mean, it's almost, it's almost,
Okay, let me rephrase the question then, so I don't get you into trouble.
you won't, go ahead.
What would you suggest that utilities need to do better on the whole to stay on the good side of a regulator anywhere?
Well, that'll be easier. And I was going to try to answer your first question too, but whether you're water, wastewater, electric, no matter what utility you are, the number one, at least for the water and wastewater utility, which I suspect this is what this is, CAWASA. It's water and sewerage utilities, as I understand it. And the number one goal or role, at least from my perspective, is producing clean, safe drinking water and producing wastewater that is not harmful to the environment. I mean, that's our function. That's the primary role. The other thing is while doing that, it is imperative that the utility perpetuate themselves. What do I mean by that? That they have the rates in place, that they have the systems in place to operate as effectively and efficiently as they can to perpetuate themselves. In other words, stuff breaks, stuff wears out. So you can't go to sleep at the wheel. Someone has to be preparing to replace, upgrade the stuff that breaks. And it should be done over the course of time so the customers don't see some kind of massive rate increase. Here's the thing, and I've said this many times, I've said it to utilities in the States all over, and even in Canada, Valerie, at Kelowna, is that I've heard for 40 years now, over 40 years, the state of our utilities, oh, we need help in the States, our systems are getting old, so forth, et cetera. And I asked this question, it was probably about 35 years ago, and it was not well received. But I said, well, let me ask you this. I said, did we go to bed last night and wake up this morning, and all of a sudden our system was 75 years old, it had gone to heck in a handbasket, and it happened overnight? And I think the person I asked that to, understandably, did not take that very well. They thought I was being a little bit facetious there, smart alecky. But the truth is, Valerie, I believe, at least what I see, and I think is important to the utilities in the States and the ones that come before us, and I think everywhere, is it is our job to provide safe water, safe drinking water, to put wastewater into the system that's not damaging the environment, and to perpetuate the system, perpetuate it with rates that are no higher than they need to be. Now, I know that sounds trite, but I believe it to my core. I do. Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a question in the chat, Mike, from Gary Pilgrim. I don't know if Gary wants to ask himself or he wants me to read it out. You may proceed, Gary.
The question is, has there been any recent conversation examples of an investor-owned utility through bankruptcy or otherwise
I
being
think that's
transformed?
conversion, Mike.
I'm sorry?
Recent conversion, not conversation.
Oh, conversion, yeah. Being transformed towards a municipal, yes. Actually, in the state I'm in, and I can't talk specifically about the case, but that very thing has occurred. There have been, there were so many, I mean, so many complaints about it's one investor-owned utility, not only the quality of service, but the rates being high, getting too high, constantly being increased, while the quality of the water system and everything else was not, to the point of where actually elected officials did get involved. And while there was no law or anything forcing the issue, there was enough, I guess, overwhelming pressure that the investor-owned utility is working with a local county utility, county government utility to take that system over. Now, they will be purchasing it, but I suspect probably not at the amount that the investor-owned utility would like to have. But yes.
Yeah, in fact, Mike, I know of a case in the Caribbean. I wouldn't mention which utilities was. There was a case where the government had ceded the public utility to a private sector arrangement in a public-private partnership arrangement. And when that failed, I think the government had to take it over. So there have been cases of that nature in our region.
Well, I guess that kind of goes to Valerie, the question she asked, and hopefully my answer wasn't too long or made sense, but to me, that gets down to the crux of the matter. You folks clearly, by virtue of the fact that you have these, that you're having these webinars, you're trying to be better, trying to learn what you can learn, be as good as you can at your jobs. And to me, that's what has to occur, because most people, the people we serve, they don't really know what we do. They don't understand this business. They expect to turn on the tap and water come out. And they expect it to be safe to drink. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
And, it's not their job to worry about that. That's our job. Well, not mine anymore, but, well, I guess it is as a regulator, but it certainly is y'all's. And I know how difficult it is. I know what a challenge it is, especially, I suspect a lot of your folks know exactly what to do, how they need to do it, and what's the best way to do it. And sometimes they just can't quite maybe get all the support they need to get that done. But you still can't give up. You got to do what you need to do.
So I have a follow-up question, Mike. With the role of a regulator, I mean, you're basically setting the rules and making sure that they're complied to. But do you find that the relationship you have with the utility as a regulator is how do you make it a good, solid relationship where it's mutually respectful, that everybody understands what the rules are and is going towards that, so that you don't end up with the utilities seeing the regulator as the big bad ogre.
Yeah. Well, that is definitely a fine line, but it is the right line. It's required of us. And in my role, the role of the Public Service Commission, and mine in particular, is not to be against the utility. It is not. Matter of fact, it is to listen to the facts, judge fairly, and consider what is in the best interest of the utility, what is in the best interest of the customer and the consuming and using public. I mean, that's just simple as that. Not one above the other, but what is, and the way it's frequently addressed, and it was in our legislation you saw, is what is just and reasonable. Now, Ignatius, I could ask you what is just and reasonable. I could ask Val, I could ask everyone listening right now, and we would probably get a few definitions of what just and reasonable is. And that is the challenge for me as a commissioner, to sit in these hearings, and our decisions have to be made based on the record, based on the testimony, the exhibits that are put into the record during a hearing, during cross-examination, during questions, and then determining what is just and reasonable from that. What is the preponderance of evidence? Did that answer it, Valerie?
Oh, sorry.
Did that sort of answer your question?
Sorry, not clicking. Yeah, as you said, it's a very fine line that you have. And sometimes I have seen where it's not always a regulator, but there's in the Caribbean, there's some of the utilities have regulators, some don't. And Ignatius, you can comment on this. But sometimes the politics really gets in the way, and there is a board of trustees or a board of governors with a chair, and they almost can start running the utility.
Well, my experience has been, and I don't mean this disrespectful toward politicians, but politicians generally make poor utility managers. They're probably good at politics, but not necessarily good at utilities or utility decisions. I don't know how all of the utilities in the Caribbean Water and Sewerage Association are set up, but here, many of them are what's called Commission of Public Works. They're set up by the cities and they're owned by the cities. Some are more eleemosynary. They're enterprise funds. In other words, they are set up to support themselves, not from any outside source. And that works best when you have utility trained people running them and not the politicians getting involved and telling them how to run it. But unfortunately, that doesn't always work. But the better systems tend to be run that way.
Yeah, well, invariably, I mean, the politics of water, and because water is life, I think there's a tendency, as you said, people want to turn on their taps and to have water. So where you have situations in the political constituencies for the politician, they would want to be sure that they make the types of interventions. But as you indicated, there is a line that one has to draw. And I think it becomes very evident where you do have regulators. And I think increasingly we are seeing to try to improve on the governance systems of the utilities. I think quite a few of the countries have moved towards having the public utilities regulated, so that in terms of the tariffs that are awarded to the utilities, where you have regulators, you can have something that is just and reasonable, because the regulator then has to hear from all the parties, from the consumers, the public utility itself, on the government side, because you have to be wary of government policy. And so it gives an opportunity to, as you said, to make those decisions based on the evidence presented. And I know in one particular jurisdiction where the regulator then thought the utility was doing so well that they did not award them. Well, they couldn't justify a rate increase. And they thought, well, look, we are being too efficient. So, you have that other extreme. But by and large, where that, again, it also helps to insulate the politicians when it comes to make with that type of decision making, so that where you have the utilities almost regulating themselves, that they are the suppliers of water, and they also set their rates. And that's old systems, but increasingly, because of a lot of work that has taken place towards improving governance and institutional strengthening in the region, we have seen some countries have moved in that direction, and it's helping, as it has done for the telecoms utilities and the power utilities.
Well, I'll say this. It's difficult and a challenge. Well, certainly probably for any of us to dictate what the politicians do, how they do it. And I'm glad to hear that it seems that they're working toward that way in many of the islands there. But one thing I can say, the only thing we can control as individuals is our attitude, what we do, how we do it, how well we do it. And I applaud you guys. And Valerie, the work that you guys do, just doing this, it may not change politicians, but it can certainly help your customer because it's helping you. So no matter what happens, keep doing the good stuff you're doing like this. And every day when you go out, no matter how frustrating, how aggravating, you do the best you can do. Leave the consequences up to God. You'll do well. Didn't mean to preach there, Ignatius.
Yeah. Well, I have to thank you for sharing giving us, some of your experiences. And of course, that is quite welcome, from being regulated to the regulator and seeing it from the other end of the prism, as it were. And some of the points that you highlighted, I think, stands in many respects pretty much what we need to do. And as we try to expose our operators to as many, a sort of broader perspective of the work that they're doing, not just dealing with those who are just operators and running laboratories or wastewater systems, but every part of the system. I think it is very good to expand your knowledge when you're working the system, and hence the reason why we have those webinars, and to expose our operators to as broad spectrum of the topics as possible. So that one of the things you mentioned was to develop and maintain well-trained staff and have a good employee performance management system in place. have a clear and concise mission statement. Why do we exist as a utility? Why do we exist as a Caribbean Water and Sewage Association? Have a clear vision for the next 5 to 10 years. So that's the vision planning. How and when we would adhere our goals, etc. And if we ignore problems, they may never get better. They always tend to get worse. And these are very wise words for us to part with. Reminds me of a book by a good friend, William T. Muhewe, who has this book called Making Public Enterprises Work. And there he mentioned some similar ideas to yours about putting the customer first, because the customer is the reason we exist. Establishing customer care units at the head office, etc. And so I think your experiences, they converge with as many of the, it's sort of something universal if we are to have successful water utilities. So that presentation is quite profound and should prove to be quite useful to those of our participants. We'd like to thank you, Mike, for sharing your experiences and the time with us this evening, as well as all of you who have joined faithfully, as usual. This is all good, and as usual, we're going to circulate the recordings of this broadcast. Thank you, Valerie, again, for finding us, Mike, and your continued support to our CAWASA Wednesday webinars.
Very welcome. I learn a lot too.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it immensely. Matter of fact, I wish I was there right now doing it face to face.
One of these days we may be able to do that.
I will certainly do it. I'll look you up.
Okay then. Thank you very much all, and have a wonderful evening. Keep well and safe.
All right. Thank you so much.
Ignition
Val.
You want to
signing
give
off.
me a quick WhatsApp afterwards?
Yeah, I will do.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. See you guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
Mike. Great to see you.